Welcome to Scary Story Podcast. Today's story will bring you back to a place of loss, memories, and discovery when a man revisits an old place in his father's stories. My name is Edwin, and here's a scary story. Hotel California was playing at the airport when I arrived in Bogota, Colombia that night. For several days, I had been seeing or hearing all of these signs, strange coincidences that led me back to my father and his memory. It had not been that long since he passed, and although all of my friends told me the same thing, to take time to myself, to take care of my mother, to not forget about me, all I could do was revisit those places my father had told me about. I knew I would find nothing when I set out, and despite the many things I bumped into, which were these signs, if you want to call them that, left me with nothing but a set of stories that nobody would believe. Just like the stories of my father. My dad had traveled a lot in his lifetime, long before he met my mother. He had many pictures of himself with travelers he met along the road all over the place, from Brazil to Nicaragua, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. I got to see him with a beard and ponchos of dark colors, his face covered in mud. I saw him sitting on curbs with plates of strange dishes and young women with braided and tangled hair. My old man always wanted me to travel. He said it would bring out more of me. Be I a fearful kid, it would bring out fear. But then it would keep it out. That it would challenge my bravery and wit and humble me down to the ground if I needed it. But on the other side, he would say, would be the real world. A thing you cannot unsee. It was a unique time, his death, you know. It was like knowing that a person died with an empty tank, who gave it everything he had before blissfully and peacefully embarking on his next journey, the one we are all on. My mother was like that too, adventurous. She understood that there was little for him to do in the world. I mean, what can you do once you've seen it all? From places on a map to your own children grow up and become parents. When you've read enough books to turn a study into a library, and have spices in jars to fill 3 cabinets labeled in languages only he was able to identify. When we all said goodbye to him, he said he would see us around. He had learned over his travels that goodbyes are not goodbyes when we're only a boat, a plane, or a bus ride away. We were not going to argue with him then. In that case, he was actually leaving the planet. No mode of transportation would be able to get us to him anymore. But that man always knew something that we didn't, and I wanted to figure that out. He had mentioned lots of places in his many stories that went over the head of my cousins and friends, but I was always amazed by one. The hotel in the middle of the road, he called it. A hostel. A peculiar place that symbolized the middle of your life, along with its peculiar location in the middle of a dirt road, on the side of a hill. Most, he would say, don't even know it's there. Just another annoying obstacle in the road, like a pothole or a dog deciding to make the warm road his bed for a nap in the middle of the day. Only those who are looking for it are the ones that can find it, despite its obvious placement. Everything had 2 or 3 meanings with my old man, and it felt like having to solve a riddle. I think Mom was the only other person who appreciated and believed what he would say. I may have picked up the same habit from her. Whenever Hotel California would play, he would say that it reminded him of that hotel, the one in the middle of the road, and the many people he met while he was there. Bizarre experiences that I had at one point thought had been induced by natural and quite intentional means. I looked for the place myself, only finding surrounding hospedajes, which are places to stay, and calling around. Ah yes, the house on the street, some would call it, with the stone walls. Others said that it was not a place to stay, and that it didn't have a phone number, then excitedly telling me of the things and the prices of what their place had to offer. But by acknowledging it, they told me that the place existed, and that's where I would be going for that night. It was a mystery unworthy of solving for just about anyone, except for me. The drive there was uneventful. with a taxi driver trying to charge me more than we had agreed to, but that was about it. I could see the place. A large house where the dirt road split by lanes to go around it. Overgrown plants from the windows on the second floor reaching the top of the doorframe on the bottom. A lush green and stuck along the stone wall. I grabbed my backpack from the seat next to me and stepped out, crossing the street to reach the large metal door knocker on the heavy wooden door as I stood on the street. No room for a sidewalk. A woman answered after the second knock, with the hinge of the door struggling to hold everything together. The woman nearly pulled me in, and before I knew it, the door had closed completely behind me. Shadows filled the entrance to that house, uncovered like a courtyard with a garden made up of many pots of plants and vines along the wall. The smell of stony musk would come in waves along with soft cold breezes that would last a few seconds at a time. Rooms lined the first and second floors with faded blue doors, a scene I had only seen in movies and my father's black and white photographs. I had been so amazed by the place that I had not noticed the woman looking at me with that smile that had given her the deep memories and reminders on the side of her face. When I looked at her, she spoke up, her hands gently reaching for my chin as she said that I reminded her of someone that she used to know. I knew at that moment that it could have been my father, but after seeing so many travelers come and go, I let go of the idea and waited for her to continue what she was saying. She smiled at me for a little bit longer, before making her way to the small reception desk on the corner of the courtyard with a large notebook. As I followed behind her, I saw a young man walk out of one of the rooms above and across from where the counter was. He was shirtless and with a bowl of soup or cereal in his hand as he waved at me, and then he made his way down the stairs. I had a photograph of my father with a spoon in his mouth in that place, and although the stories of my father served as a way to remind me of him and everything he did for our family, the stories themselves, as I said, were not easy to believe. If I was going to be able to discover how much truth was contained in them, I had to be ready to shatter and re-glue the pieces of his stories to live the rest of my life truly knowing who he was. A complex life full of lessons and curiosity. The same curiosity he had passed on to us. It was that same sense of curiosity that had driven me there, wondering how such a fearless man who hopped on boats and planes and buses to get where he wanted, sometimes without a map, the same person who would eat foods from questionable places and dodged one too many accidents throughout his life, could be so afraid of one thing, of the nothingness when the light goes out. And not a normal fear of darkness, mind you, one that would trouble him for days. Mom would say that he would sometimes scream, more so when they were younger, and that he would hide by the light of the television when he would turn it on in the middle of the night. He had installed emergency floodlights that must have turned on less than 5 times in his lifetime for blackouts in the house. At least that's what he would say. And it's interesting to think how little us humans are in complete and total darkness. You can probably count those times in one hand. And for Dad, that would be more than enough. "Where are you from, my friend?" the guy with the bowl asked. Noodles, by the way, is what had been in there. He had finally made it downstairs, flip-flopping all the way to us. His accent was from somewhere in Europe. "The United States," I said, as he smiled and started telling me about his life. But as he spoke, all I heard was my father and his stories. The places he had visited, the people he had met, and the nightmares. I would be the only one who would listen, like actually listen to his stories. He would tell me how the world has good parts, but is also full of things not many of us are aware of, much less have experienced them. Things that lurk around corners. Things that wait for your permission to join you. And that once they do, they don't leave easily. The guy and I spoke for a bit as the old woman, just like my own mind, wandered away. The woman to the kitchen area of the place, and my mind to the photographs with the questions I came looking to answer. Part 2 of Stories of My Father continues right after this. I'm very grateful to have sponsors support my stories, and I help pick them out. So if you're interested, please check them out. Anyway, stay with me. My father used to speak of a friend, a young woman he met at that place who told him that, unaware of what she was getting into and being betrayed through a young drama thing, as he called it, she went to seek help where she was not supposed to. She used to stay there, although not as a traveler, but as a helper. She would wash the towels and the floors. She would do the shopping and run general errands around the hostel. And one night, as he was trying to go to sleep, he heard people running along the corridors outside of his room with shouting, the most terrifying, deepest, darkest scream he had ever heard. Travelers yelled and ran to the first floor. The door to the outside was locked for the night, and the owner of the house had only turned on the light to his room but had not gotten out just yet, when another scream, a growl, rumbled throughout the entire building. The owner finally came out and ran toward the kitchen area that led into a small hallway into another set of rooms. Worried that a thief had somehow climbed inside, he ran around looking up toward the walls and windows, calling out for Elena, the young girl, to come out. My father ran toward her room and knocked on the door before the owner, her father, took out the set of keys and opened her room. That's when he saw her body flat against the ceiling, above her bed. Some of the travelers, backpackers, people who roamed with guidebooks that had not prepared them for anything like this, panicked. Some, my father told me, had passed out and others had vomited. Fear, he used to say, real fear, has a power over your body. Our mind is the one that makes the stories, and only those we can deal with. Stories were the ones that came once the rumors started spreading of the girl who became possessed. About half of the people in the hostel left that morning, and the next few days there were only 4 of them left once the event started. Growls like from an animal could be heard from the corners. The sounds of objects breaking in the kitchen during the day, and the sudden freezing gusts of wind that would fill the rooms unexpectedly were just some of the minor things. The remaining people there, a young woman from Brazil, and 2 other young men, one from Germany and the other from Sweden, along with my father, had all spoken of the dark shadow that would come into the rooms at night. It had turned into somewhat of a habit that they would stay up late into the night on the couch in the middle of the courtyard, all of them with no plan to go anywhere just yet. For young people who had escaped work right after college or college altogether, this was one of those experiences that, although was terrifying, would bring them to life. My father explained it calmly and with facts to me, along with the photograph he took one night. In it, you could see the outline of a window frame, with what I imagined had at one point been a bluish light from the outside, and a dark black patch in the figure of a tall man on the right side of it. So dark, you would think it was simply a missing part of the picture, like a spot of black ink, completely standing out from the wall next to the window, which was already dark. Priests, he said, would visit the hostel looking for the owner and his daughter, Elena, who had become sick by that time, unable to stand up. Clara, one of the travelers, would be the one to help out with her meals. She confided in my father many years later that she would dread going into her room because of the smell and the way her eyes looked at her. Everyone spoke of her eyes. When my father first told me this story, I asked what the eyes looked like. The best he was able to describe them as, he asked if I had ever seen an eyeball, a real human eyeball unattached. Even though I hadn't, that image in my mind never left me. My father had collected photograph after photograph of almost every corner of that enormous house in the middle of the road. I knew because of those photographs where the common areas in the garden were and where they used to be, where the old television had been at one point, And some of those photographs with the handwritten caption on the back would invite you to look at certain corners of it to spot the dark phenomenon he had captured. Elena got worse before she got better, with strange voices that would follow her as soon as she was able to stand up. Doors, heavy wooden doors, would slam shut right in front of her. She would scream and cry when this happened, and her story got the attention of other people in town. New backpackers would arrive at the place, unaware of the stories within those walls, and soon, my father was the only one left who had been there from the start of everything, and he would have to decide whether to explain or keep it to himself whenever someone would bring up something unusual that happened to them in that place. To those that he suspected could handle it, he would tell, in a way that made me feel proud of knowing his stories. Elena was eventually cured thanks to a woman who came from the mountains along with a priest from her town. The story was rarely spoken about again, and just like with other tales that survive on word of mouth, it was eventually forgotten. But whatever darkness had arrived had stayed in the place, at least for a while, and it took my father years of nightmares to finally realize how much it had affected him and the owner of the place. Not 5 years after my father had left to continue his travels, he found out Andres, the owner, had passed away in his sleep with no explanation. De miedo, they would say. Out of fear. And that's when his fear of the dark started, I think. My father claimed he would get visits. When he would tell my brothers and I about it, he would say that he was going to be okay. That it was only the events that haunted him and nothing more. Just stories. And just like that, I had many other of his stories in other places. Haunting tales of how he went to seek protection afterward from that same woman and the priest who came from the mountains. His search for the dark entity in the photographs. A short biography on Elena depicting her account, all handwritten by my father and tucked away in a drawer. The story of a young woman and her problems that I knew far too well from the many times he had told and retold me the same things. When I asked the guy with the bowl of soup about the owners, he pointed me to a portrait on the wall, on the part where the garden was. In it was a man with his wife and young daughter, Andres, Ana, and their daughter Elena, taken in front of the large house. I had gone out early that next morning to walk around town, and when I got back, breakfast was served in the small table by the kitchen, with the old woman smiling at me. I could speak no Spanish, but I understood café con pan, said in the same way my father would call coffee with bread. And it was like I knew her when she introduced herself finally. Elena. My eyes lit up. This had been the young woman from the stories, and just like that, I knew that at least part of it had been true. Part of me wanted to show her the photographs I had brought with me, but all I could tell her that morning was my father's name as I put my hand over my chest and then above my head, as a way to try to tell her who I was. She smiled in the same way my dad's friend smiled. I remember even at his funeral, they looked at me with a smile, knowing that I had gotten great lessons. And then dozens and dozens of his friends arrived, all of them knowing he had used up his life in the way every person should. She told me to wait as she walked into the hallway past the kitchen and came back with a dark green book, a photo album, full of pictures of travelers with their long hair, clothes, and bags of chips that took you back to simpler times. Unattached from phones and the internet, just friends and phone calls. And she stopped flipping through the pages as I saw the young man with the poncho and beard. My father. She showed me a photograph of him with a light bulb over his head, laughing hysterically. The one of the chicken bones sticking out by the side of his mouth like a cigarette. My father with friends he had made along the road with paper hats and a birthday cake in the middle. I smiled as I flipped through those pages, looking for more photographs of him. The stories he had captured versus the ones he had left behind. So different. I thought of all the stories he had collected as I flipped through those collected of him. Elena walked over to the counter as the guy with the bowl from the day before came over. In just one day, we had talked of our lives and walked around town to the cheap restaurant at the end of the street. Friends already. I laughed at the bowl he was carrying once again, so I grabbed the fruit bowl from the table and held it the same way he did. We had a good laugh. Elena came back with her camera just at that moment as I heard the click and shutter. My father was right. The only things that survive are our stories. That everyone, even my father, would be just a boat, a plane, or a bus ride away. According to your comments over on Spotify, you are looking for a scarier story about the supernatural, and there's one in the works that will bring you into a nightmare. In the meantime, check out our other podcast on Scary FM, or go ad-free on Scary Plus, either on your Apple Podcast app or on scaryplus.com to listen right where you're listening right now. Thank you very much for listening to my stories. See you soon.